Hey everybody, this is Swift from Major League Hacking. You're tuning in now for our intro to budgeting workshop. Uh, we're going to go through some of the basics around how to budget for your hackathon. So let's kick it off. So first off, who am I and why am I talking to you about budgeting? Well, as I alluded to before, my name is Swift. I'm the former commish of Major League Hacking these days, CEO. On League. Every semester, hundreds of universities put on hackathons all over the world, and Major League Hacking is a support organization that works with student hackers. And oh, did I drop off? Okay, I think I'm back. Sorry, guys, we had some slight technical difficulties there. Yes, so Major League Hacking is the world's official student hackathon league. We work with hundreds of student hackathons all over the world, mentorship organization, and to help support the student hacker movement as well. Before that, I was working in this little outfit called Hacker League, which was a platform for people who organize hackathons. Before that, I was working over at SendGrid as a developer evangelist, and before that, I was an engineer over at CrowdTech. So enough about me. Let's talk about budgeting. So why the first thing we want to talk about with budgeting, or I guess let's go over the things we're going to talk about today first. So this is the content I think we're going to cover. The first question is why is it important to budget? Like, why are we even talking about this to begin with? Then we'll cover some core concepts, things that you need to know in order to budget for your event. And then in part 3, we'll walk through actually creating a budget. And then in part 4, we'll do some pro tips and common pitfalls that people run into. And at the end, in part 5, we'll take some questions from the audience if they have any. Throughout this time, Nick will be accepting questions in the chat room, so feel free to pass those along to him, and he'll queue them up for me at the end. And then also we'll write a little recap after this presentation, answering any questions we didn't get a chance to answer today. So, question 1, why is it important to budget? Like any enterprising person, you should think about this before you do anything. Like, why am I actually going through the task of creating a budget? Creating a budget is not really necessarily an easy task that you do in a matter of seconds. It's something that you should put some thought and energy into. So why do you need it? And the reason is that budgeting helps you answer some really important questions around your event. For instance, how much does it cost to throw a hackathon? Well, a budget will tell you exactly how much it costs. Your school wants to know. When you go and present to your school administration telling them about this hackathon, they're going to want to know how much it costs to put on. Having a budget is a great way to show them what it will cost to do the event, and it's a that everybody's pretty familiar with. How much should you charge your sponsors? Well, it's really hard to know that unless you know how much money you need to raise, and the only way to know that is if you budget. And then how should I spend my sponsorship money? Well, it's really hard to know how much you should spend on something unless you know how much other money you have to play with. For instance, should I spend $10,000 on food or should I spend $5,000 on food? Well, it's really hard to know unless you have a big bird's eye view of everything that's going on. So budgeting will help you answer some of those core questions, and it'll give you a much better idea about the event you're planning and what you need to do. So let's review some core concepts that are important to budgeting. These are things that you should know before you even sit down to write a budget at all. And some of these are basic accounting concepts. In fact, I think that like knowing some basic accounting can be really helpful. Revenue, expenses, and then cost per attendee. So revenue, very simply put, is income, or AKA cash money. This is generally sponsorship for hackathons, but I have known some hackathons that have revenue. The event, though, counts as revenue. There's different classes of revenue to keep in mind. So there's projected revenue, so that's how much you think you're going to get. There's so there's projected revenue, that's how much you think you're going to get. There's invoiced revenue, which is how much you've actually successfully invoiced companies for. And then there's cash on hand, which is the amount of money you've actually successfully received after invoicing. So those are all different, to keep that in mind. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Expenses, these are your costs. These are the things that you spend money on. This is like, well, we'll go through exactly the components of this and what they mean, but this is where you spend your money, pretty simply. And it's going to be really important to know how much you're spending in different categories. Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is cost per attendee. I've talked about this in other workshops before, specifically from the sponsor side, but this time I want to talk about it from the budgeting and organizer side. So cost per attendee, pretty simply, is the ratio of the total cost over the number of people. So if you think about it in terms of your event, your total cost would be the total amount you have budgeted for the event over the total number of people. What you really want to do is minimize that ratio. So you want to make sure that the cheaper your cost per attendee, the more efficient you're spending your money. So you can get a good idea of what some traditional cost per attendee looking at. Some open source budgets. I know that Bitcamp and HackMIT both have published their budgets on the internet. You can just check those out for sure. I'm doing it. Generally speaking, I think there's 6 things that I see in most budgets. There's certainly other things that end up costing you money, and most of those will fall into that miscellaneous category. But there's 5 general large categories that just about every single hackathon needs. So the first one is food and snacks. The next one is shirts and swag. The next one is prizes. The next one is venue. The 5th one is transportation, and the final one is miscellaneous. And we'll dive into what each of these means. So the first question you want to ask yourself, actually, before you even get into any of this, is how long is my hackathon? Because that's actually going to dictate the first section, which is food. So we estimate that meals are about $7 per person per meal. In a 24-hour event, you'd have either breakfast or lunch on the first day, then dinner, of course, and then breakfast, lunch on the second day. So you end up with between 4 and 5 meals. For a 36-hour hackathon, you typically have dinner on Friday, breakfast, lunch, and dinner on Saturday, breakfast, lunch. Is about average, where you can get things like bagels, which cost sometimes in the order of a few dollars, and you can get like things that are actual meals like burritos that cost on the order of 10. So it averages out to about $7 per person. Snacks and drinks are about $10 total per person for the weekend, and that's if you really budget high and you buy a lot of snacks. Realistically, you can probably get away with about $5 per person if you're skimping a little bit. The thing to think about is shirts and swag. Most events buy T-shirts. You can often get them donated by companies in exchange for sponsorship, so custom ink, Teespring, something like that. Typically, we see that shirts cost between $4 and $10 per shirt. $4 a shirt is really low. Those are like really poor quality shirts usually. $10 a shirt is American Apparel style stuff, which is the good stuff. Generally speaking, you're going to pay less when you print more T-shirts. The thing you have to remember about T-shirts is that what the actual cost center is the fabric. So the number of shirts is actually what dictates the cost. But there is some base cost associated with it for setup of the graphics. And the more colors on your shirt, the more expensive they'll be. There's other kinds of swag out there that aren't shirts that can be even more cost effective. I've seen some really interesting things like shorts. I know HackerU did those. Hats, Pen Apps has done in the past. Scarves, sweatpants, gloves, whatever, things like that. So you should definitely look into alternatives to T-shirts because they can be quite expensive and they're often overdone a little bit. The next thing to think about is prizes. So we've seen a trend where events oftentimes will offer monetary prizes. Our experience at MLH has been that non-monetary experience-based prizes are actually way better than monetary prizes. There's 2 reasons for that. The first one is raw costs. When you have cash prizes, that can be an extremely high cost center for your event. But experience and non-monetary prizes are things that hackers tend to really enjoy and don't necessarily cost as much. So experience prizes are things that you are literally experiences that you wouldn't necessarily buy for yourself. One of my favorite examples is Twilio used to buy 20 movie tickets for you and all of your friends to go see a movie together, which is pretty awesome. Like, how often would you do that unless you wanted a prize? Or another example might be buying medieval time trip for you and 5 of your friends, or paying for you to take a trip to the company HQ, something like that, where it's an experience. Non-monetary prizes are things like trophies, medals, handcrafted things. It could be tech, like the latest, like Oculus Rifts or like Mayos. Anything that keeps a hacker hacking after the event is always pretty good. So look to alternatives to cash prizes to save money. Typically, we think that prizes shouldn't cost more than a couple $1,000s, maybe $1,000 on the low end and $3,000 on the high end. Venue costs. This is the single biggest variable when it comes to budgeting for hackathons. If your venue is free, you'll save a lot of money. Oftentimes, if you go with your school, that's one of the best ways to save money, is because they will give you the venue for free. Excuse me. If you end up paying for a venue, there are lots of other hidden costs, right? You might end up having to pay for Wi-Fi because there's not infrastructure. You might have to pay for a generator because there's not enough power. You might be locked into their catering, and trust me, catering is way more expensive than buying from external caterers. You might need to have security. You might need to have a fire marshal. There's tons of variable costs that go into the venues. So the single most important decision you can make when you're planning your hackathon is where you're going to host it. Make sure you ask questions about what costs are associated with the venue and what you need to do to cover those costs. The next section is transportation. We estimate that the average charter bus costs about $3,300 per bus. Travel reimbursements can run anywhere from the order of $25 all the way up to $200 per person. I've done a whole workshop on transportation. We'll send out links to that afterwards. But transportation is another huge variable cost. If everybody can get to your event for free or for cheap, then obviously you save a lot of money doing that. The final category is the miscellaneous category. This pretty much covers anything that's not one of those major categories. Some examples would be marketing, supplies, that might be extension cords or markers or name tags, printing if you need to print waivers or signs, stickers, tips, emergency food, things like that. Let's talk now about some common pitfalls and pro tips. These are things that we've seen help when you're doing budgeting. So pro tip number one is always, always, always budget high. A mistake I often see is the first-time budgeters will estimate based on what they actually think things will cost, down to the zero. The trick is always budget high, because it's better to have money left over at the end than to have not enough money. Not understanding payment cycles. This one kills me. I watch this happen all the time. So, excuse me. Early on, we talked about how there's different classes of revenue. So projected revenue, invoiced revenue, and then cash on hand. So when events invoice companies, they automatically assume that the revenue is accounted for, but they don't think about how companies pay out invoices, which can actually be on the order of 3 to 4 months later. So an event will invoice a large company, and then they'll spend money as if they know that they're going to get the check from the company they've invoiced in the next couple of weeks. But realistically, it can take a number of months. And be able to deal with those payment cycles inside cash flow. Last pro tip, build an emergency fund into your budget. I often recommend building in an extra $1,000 to $5,000 depending on the size of the event. This can be really good just in case something goes wrong. Maybe you didn't order enough food. Maybe something happened to one of your meals and you need to replace it. Maybe all of your Wi-Fi goes down and you need to go out and buy routers. Having an emergency fund on hand makes it really easy to deal with those problems when they arise and fix them in real time. So that's the basics of budgeting. I think now we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great rundown of all the costs that you might experience when you're doing an event Swift. So we got a number of really good questions throughout the presentation, and hopefully we'll get some more. So if you have a question for Swift that you'd like to answer or have him answer, please go to the question box. It should be like there or there on your screen. I'm not quite sure. And ask it, and we'll try and have him answer it. So the first question comes from Andrea Barak from Dragon Hacks, and it was something you kind of answered throughout your presentation, but how much should you actually over budget? Like, what should that emergency fund be?
Yeah, I think the emergency fund, like I've seen other like people with hard numbers like 10% or like things like that. But I mean, if you when you start getting up into the order of like hundreds of thousands of dollars of budget, having an emergency fund of that much can be kind of overkill, I think. My typical gut says that like going with a couple $1,000s is pretty good. Generally speaking, like I think the lowest you should have is on the order of like $1,000, and again on the high end, I think like $5,000 is usually acceptable. If you think about it, like you should be able to order pizza for every single person at your event if you need to. Like that's a good measure, right? Because like that's one of the most common issues that happens is there's like not enough food, right? Or like that meal needs to be replaced or something. So being able to order pizza for everybody is like a pretty good baseline. And if you can do it multiple times over, that's like pretty good to know too.
So I guess a follow-up question there is how do you know when to spend your emergency budget?
Yeah, I mean, like you typically know when things are going wrong. You need to listen to your attendees for sure. Like, oftentimes, like if there's not enough food, an attendee will come up to an organizer and like tell them that straight up. You can also keep an eye on like social channels, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. People know when things are going wrong. Uh, I think that you should have a pretty good before you spend the budget. You should have a pretty good idea that what you're going to do is going to work. So like a good example is you might have the Wi-Fi might be something might be wrong with the Wi-Fi, and you have a theory that like if you buy some extra routers, you can reduce some of the load on some of the existing ones, but you're not really sure. Like that might not be the best way to spend the emergency budget unless you're like pretty confident what you're doing will work. Because remember, especially if you can't return them. If you can return them, it's kind of a different story. But you just want to make sure that like the emergency money is being used for emergencies, I guess, and that is what I'm getting at, and that your actual solution makes sense for.
All right. Thanks so much. The next question comes from us from Leo Rudberg of Mad Hacks, and that is, should you scale your budget with sponsorship, or should you have a single monolithic budget? So that's to say, should you change your budget as you get more or fewer sponsors, or should you have like that one overall number?
Yeah, I didn't really touch on this, but oftentimes I like to create a minimalist budget and then a like dream budget.
Can you tell us more about that minimalist and that dream budget? You cut out a little bit, it sounds like.
And then, sorry, did I cut out there, Nick?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I like to create like a minimal budget and then a dream budget. So the minimal budget just covers the bare basic bones of what I need to throw, the event that I want to throw, and then the dream budget is like if was just rolling in cash and could throw whatever event that I wanted to do. So having two budgets, like a really bare bones one and a one that's got a little bit of padding in it, can be a good practice. But generally speaking, you should work towards your bare bones budget until you've actually achieved that, and then expand to the more dream budget later on.
Great, thanks. So the next question comes from us from Arthur Sirkin. I'm sorry, Arthur, from Hack Western, and he asks, in those situations where you do have an on-campus caterer that you're locked into, how can you deal with that and that very high price that they charge?
Yeah, so I've actually seen people work with on-campus caterers pretty successfully. I'd give a shout out to the Rutgers kids right now because so Rutgers has rules about where you can order food from, and HackRU has had to order food from the same guy like forever. But typically, like on-campus caterers will be willing to work with you to get whatever kind of food you want. You're right that it will cost you like more money than it would if you went outside, but typically they are willing to be flexible on like the kinds of things they offer, given that the volume that you're asking for is not might be higher than they're used to, or it might be a special set of circumstances. So like a great example is like the Rutgers kids would always ask this guy who ran the falafel restaurant or whatever. I don't know exactly what it was, but it's like Mediterranean kind of food, and they would always ask him to make things like chicken fingers or like Rutgers has these sandwiches called fat sandwiches, which are just like basically cheese sticks with tons of other stuff on them, things like that. So it's definitely possible to work with them to come up with a menu and offering that you want. You are right that you're going to end up with a high price, and like there's not a lot you can do about that. I mean, the best thing you can do is appeal to them to be sympathetic and try to work with them on price as best as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the next question comes to us from Alex Corey of Hacking EDU, and he wants to know a little bit more about that turnaround time for checks and invoices. And you dropped off a little bit there, so it might be worth repeating a little bit of what you said in the presentation as well.
Yeah, totally. So basically, the way it works is companies have this idea of like net payable. So, for example, net 15 basically means that from the day they receive the invoice, they don't cut the check until 15 days after they've received that invoice. So, or they don't have to cut the check until 15 days after. They can do it before, but typically they don't. So, what happens with a lot of events is that they'll like invoice a sponsor and then they'll assume suddenly that they'll have the cash or the check in like a matter of days. But some large companies, like they'll have things like net 90 or net like 6 months, which is absurd. But when you're a large company, like that's just what you do. So knowing like what the payment cycles are and what your projected cash flow is over the course of your time leading up to and after an event is really, really important. The best way to get around the net payable cycle is to like ask the person who is your direct contact if they can pay a portion of it on a credit card, because usually people have some small discretionary budget on a credit card, and then they have to request actually to pay everything else via check, and that's where the like net payable accounting department kind of stuff comes in. But typically you end up paying credit card fees then, so that might not always be the best option. So if you can wait it out, that's usually the best bet. But if you're in a pinch, that's a good alternative.
So Alex came with a follow-up question as well, and perhaps you could just explain this and how large companies work to a degree. But he said like, but wait, I put a date on the sponsorship agreements. Shouldn't they have to abide by that date when we send them the invoice?
You think so, but the truth is, like most large companies, they operate like independent entities, right? So just because the person in who you're interacting with wants to sponsor your event and wants to be there, that doesn't mean that the person in the accounting department has like the same interests and the same job, right? Like really the person's job in the accounting department is to manage the cash flow of the business. And so like the only way to really do that effectively is to have these like procedures in place, like net whatever, however many days it is. Also, businesses tend to operate on budget cycles. So like, and then, I mean, that's quarterly, right? So the money they might be spending on your event might not even exist until the following quarter, which is like quite possible, right? So if that's true, then it means that you have at least 3 months before you'll even have access to, that money to show up. So oftentimes departments are operating on those budgets, and like that's what's actually preventing them from being able to pay you immediately.
Gotcha. So Katie Anderson, also from Mad Hacks, asks, how do we get legal representation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So two ways I would recommend doing it, and it depends on your current situation. One is if you're a student organization, your school has lawyers that are their job is to represent student organizations. So reaching out to the school's like legal department can be really easy and beneficial. And if there's a question of like something that needs to get done legally, I mean, it's their obligation to help you with it. Uh, I mean, obviously you should be nice to them and you should like go in and be friendly and whatnot. Yeah, I mean, they're there to help you. Like that's their job. If you are not running it through your school and you have an independent entity, oftentimes the best bet is just to pay for some legal advice. Truth be told, if you explain your situation to a lot of lawyers, like they'll sympathize with the fact that you're a student organization, and they might even do it pro bono. There's lots of great places to find, references for lawyers. Your school actually probably has a list of lawyers who work with the school or like they recommend for sure. I know that almost every school has like a list of service professionals that they recommend for accounting and legal and future planning and like things like that. So I would check with the school on that, and then obviously asking for personal referrals from people in the community is another great way to go too.
Okay, great. And then another follow-up from that same question is how do we provide taxable receipts or invoices?
Yeah, so that's another tricky one here. So, okay, let me see how I can explain this. So if you're a student organization, a lot of this is handled by the school. So you'll be required to submit receipts for any expenses that you have, which is good. Like you should keep receipts for everything in general. So the school will handle all the accounting stuff for you, and which is one of the big advantages of being a school org. In the event that you're not a student org and you have like an LLC or like some other corporate entity that you're using for the event, my recommendation is always to create a single member LLC. Typically that could be something like the Rutgers Alumni, like Hacker Alumni Association or something like that, right? And basically what it is it's like the advantage of doing a single member LLC is that instead of having to go through an accountant to file taxes jointly, there's actually a single additional line on your tax return for single member LLCs. So you basically take your total revenue, your total expenses, subtract the two, and you come up with profit, and the profit is what you end up paying taxes on. So it's literally just checking an additional box on your typical tax return. Whereas if you're a multi-member LLC, you oftentimes will have to actually get an accountant to help you with it. Regardless, you should keep receipts for everything. Like literally use Expensify or like some other expense tracking software to like keep track of it all, because in the event that you do get audited, which is like very unlikely, but if it does happen, you're going to be really glad that you had all those receipts.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from us, again from Alex Corey, who's asking some great questions, as is everybody else. I just want to add, these are some really fantastic questions. Alex asks, what are some examples of companies who provide insurance for hackathons, and how much should we budget for insurance for a student hackathon?
Yeah, there's tons of companies out there that will provide insurance. Honestly, like if you just Google event insurance, there's like a million of them that will come up. One-off event insurance actually doesn't cost that much. It's like on the order of a couple $100s.
Swift, can you perhaps tell us more about how it's on the order of a couple $100? You dropped off a little bit.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, if you Google like event insurance, like, there's going to be tons of providers that come up, and almost any insurance company offers one-off event insurance. The cost is typically like on the order of a couple $100s, so like $200 to $300 from what I remember, for like a really basic policy. Generally, if you're a student organization, your school actually already has insurance for you, which is great. So you can just use theirs. If your venue requires
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the venue requirement? Again, you dropped off a little bit. So if your venue requires insurance.
Sorry.
So the last thing we heard was if your venue requires insurance.
Right. So if your venue requires insurance, typically what they're looking for is for them to be named on the policy so that they're actually a beneficiary of it. So usually just getting a one-off policy for them is like the cheapest option. And honestly, like my advice is to just go online and Google event insurance and just pick one of the policies. There's a lot of them that are self-service, so literally you fill out the form, and then next thing you know, you have the event insurance.
Very cool. So we have another question that is geared a little bit more towards sponsorship and budgeting, but it all has to do with money. And this is again from Andrea Barak of Dragon Hacks, and that is, what's the best source of finding viable emails for potential sponsors?
Yeah, there's a couple of tools. Honestly, like if you check out the sponsorship workshop we did a couple weeks ago, which we can send out the link to that after this. There's some good tools in there, but my advice is LinkedIn, data.com, using Reportive and guess and checking. Those are all like really good ways to do it. Typically, like email addresses all have like a pretty similar format, so if you can figure out somebody's email address at the company, you can guess what another person's email would be. So example would be like, all right, if Google employees have like the email address format like larry.page@google.com, well, you can guess like sergey.brin is Sergey's email, right? So a little bit of guess and check. Data.com is always great for like being able to address this for other email addresses, and then LinkedIn. I mean, obviously, if you connect with people, you can just see their email address.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Swift. That is all the questions that we have for now. So if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to hit us up. We're always available at hi@mlh.io. You can also hit up me or Swift, nq@mlh.io or swift@mlh.io. That's some emails that do not follow a pattern. We don't like to get hit up by people who don't know us. Swift, do you want to take it home?
Yeah, totally. All right, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have more questions or anything, you can obviously tweet at us or email us. We'll write up answers to any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer on the talk, and hopefully we'll see you again next time.